Good evening and welcome to the special election edition of the Late Debate. London goes to the polls in a week's time to elect 32 new London Borough Councils and an entire slate of European MPs for the capital. Oh, and in 4 boroughs they'll also be electing their local mayor as well. We'll take a look at those council battlegrounds in the second half of our programme with the LSE's Professor Tony Travers. But before then, we're going to focus not on next week's elections or even on next year's general election, but on the 2016 London mayoral election contest, which, believe it or not, is already well underway. Transport writer and campaigner Christian Wolmar has thrown his hat into the ring and is pushing to become Labour's candidate in the contest. And I'm delighted that he's here in the studio with me tonight to talk about his campaign. A very warm welcome to you.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thank you, Alastair.
Interestingly, my first question is informed by our existing and long-standing relationship. I'm a former industrial correspondent and what have you, and I've known you for years as the man to turn to on transport issues. Why would you want to chuck that in for the bed of nails at City Hall?
Well, of course, I've not only been writing about transport over the years, I've been writing about sort of other aspects that the mayor would cover, such as housing, local government and the like. And, you know, I've always been interested in politics. You know, it's that side of that I've always written about. You know, transport, as you know, is a highly politicised issue, and so is housing. So it was quite natural, really, for me to think, well, I would quite like to actually go on the other side and go into trying to change the things that I see going wrong.
So in that sense, and it's an important point I will draw out if I may, you are a party man and you want to do it that way rather than be an independent. And you make it very clear, and I quote, that London is becoming the preserve of the rich and privileged, and again I quote, that people who make London vibrant and diverse are being driven out. That's quite old Labour.
No, I don't think so at all. I think that's actually something that Labour now is very worried about. I mean, look at, for example, what Ed Miliband has announced recently about the private rented sector and trying to protect tenants, giving them 3-year deals. That's one of the things that has come up a lot in all the meetings I've been to. I've been around London. I've been doing this since 2012, and I've been to around 40 meetings and got lots of ideas from people at these meetings, and that's something they're really concerned about.
But Ed Balls is quoted in the newspapers this morning as saying the party nationally at the general election is not going to win if it goes in as a party that is not friendly to the business community. I quote you back. It's becoming the preserve of the rich and privileged.
Well, I think they're different things. I think, you know, if you're a Russian oligarch who's coming here with their billions, you're not actually doing much for Londoners. And that's something I'm really worried about. The fact that there is all this luxury housing being built that Boris Johnson has allowed to happen. And, you know, if you get a space of land used up by luxury housing that no ordinary Londoner is ever going to be able to afford, is that any use? Is that sustainable in the long run? It isn't. So, you know, I think you don't have to be on the side of the rich to be on the side of, you know, ordinary business people doing a real entrepreneurial job.
I've got a couple of questions for you specifically on housing in a moment, but I want to carry on with my sort of general let's get to know where you are coming from theme. You've also said, and I refer to my notes to get it right, that you admire new and visionary mayors, and you quote Bill Blasio in New York, and perhaps closer to home, independent, underlined, George Ferguson, I beg your pardon, in Bristol. What makes them different? Why do you think Bill works in New York and George works in Bristol?
Well, I think what's interesting, and there's other examples from around the world, there's a new phenomenon of people, a bit like me, coming from outside the traditional politics and saying, well, I think I can contribute something here. Maybe they've got some expertise in particular areas.
A party man, but not a machine man.
Absolutely. That would define me absolutely perfectly. You know, I'm not somebody who would absolutely kind of slavishly follow every word and be that sort of, you know, boring machine. We've got too many of them, you know, people who just never deviate at all with the slightest line. So I think one could take, there is space in this to take an independent but basically pro-Labour line, because, you know, I've been a Labour man, you know, virtually all my life. I did leave over Iraq briefly and then came back. And you know, what I believe in is that Labour Party, will always do more for the poor and underprivileged than the other parties. And that's crucial.
All right. Final point then on the generality. I know no more than you who's going to win the general election in 2015, but there's a distinct possibility, looking at the polls at the moment, that if you won in 2016, you'd be working with a Labour administration that has to be sensitive to all of those things. And along comes this free radical Wolmar. Have you spoken to Ed Miliband? Have you spoken to the leadership about this ambition?
I've spoken to a lot of people in
have you been encouraged?
The Labour Party, and a few of them have not liked what I'm doing, but I must say the most of them have really liked this idea. They said, somebody like me, coming from, outside the tradition of existing politicians, will, wake up the selection process. Indeed, I am the only declared candidate so far.
Sure.
A lot of people are
Well, I tried to persuade Tessa Jowell to declare one way or the other on this very programme. She declined.
Yes, no, and that's a great shame, because I think we could really have done with a much longer process. Unfortunately, the selection process is not going to start for another year. So, I'm in here on my own, putting forward ideas, and I'm very worried about some of what's happening in London. I mean, you raised one of it, the idea of all these rich people coming in, living in luxury housing. I'm worried about, pollution and congestion and all those things. And I think it'd be great if we were having a discussion about it now, and we'll select a Labour Party candidate in time for the general election. But unfortunately, it's not going to be. Sure. But you've got me for the next year.
Fun. All right, let's talk about transport first of all, a subject about which you know a little, as we've already established. What's wrong with London Underground?
Well, I think on the whole, we have a very good public transport system.
Heavily invested in, reformed of trade union relationships.
Well, there have been some industrial relations issues, but I think that's mainly caused by Boris being very, very aggressive. I'll tell you what the main thing in terms of transport. Transport has two sides. It has this idea that it helps everybody get around. Absolutely vital. Public transport, absolutely vital in London. But it's also the damaging side, and that is largely caused by traffic and cars. And I think we need to rebalance that.
All right. What about bikes? We need to. You pro-bike?
Yes, I'm very pro-bike.
Barclays say that's coming to an end. So would you replace it? Would there be Wolmar bikes? Have you got somebody in your back pocket?
Yeah, it doesn't alliterate as well. But Christian cycles maybe, and certainly I certainly support that. I certainly support cycling. I support walking. I see a slightly different. Particularly central London to what we have at the moment. Parliament Square, just near here, is a nightmare for the tourists and the people who work around here. Getting across from Westminster Tube is almost impossible. You need to break that up and have more pedestrianised zones, a much friendlier, nicer city.
Right. Go from the micro to the macro. HS2 you do not like?
Well, HS2, I think High Speed 2, the line from London to Birmingham and then Manchester and Leeds, I think it's the wrong sort of project. I'm always in favour of sort of, smaller projects that can make a huge difference. On the whole, of course you need the occasional big one, Crossrail is great, but on the whole I think you ought to look at kind of smaller change. HS2 is this huge project that's going to cause a lot of damage to London. Some 500-600 homes lost in Camden. Euston being chaotic for 10 years. And I'm not convinced, despite the fact I'm a trainman, I love the railways, I'm not convinced that this is really needed.
So as far as overground is concerned, job done in London?
Well, no, again, I think there's a lot of routes of old railway lines in London which you could reopen, which you could kind of create, and I think there ought to be schemes to have tram routes. In Paris, they've got about 3 or 4 tram routes, and orbital routes.
Croydon is there.
Croydon is very successful.
Time is against us, and you'll come back and do this again, I hope. Housing. You've made your position clear about oligarchs and the kind of, Kensington Palace Road end of it. Ken Livingstone struck a deal that you could only develop housing in London if you also made affordable housing a part of it. It's been a partial success, but not an overwhelming success. What's the Wolmar formula?
Oh, absolutely the same. And,
But how would you then enforce it? Because that was Ken's problem.
Well, you just have to thrash out deals with developers. And I think you probably need some new legislative ideas, like, for example, that developers can't just sit on their land banks forever. They would have to release the land if they're not doing anything with it. And also there's the issue of small builders. Boris is kind of spending a lot of time dealing with all these big builders who build big schemes. There's a lot of small sites that if you help the small builders do it, they could actually provide quite a lot of housing. And
last 30 seconds. To do all of that, you need to know these people. You need to know the builders, the bankers, the movers and shakers in government. You've got a lot of brilliant ideas, but you're very inexperienced.
Well, no, look, I've spent all my life talking to senior planners, senior housing officials, senior transport officials, all the like, and I've also been gathering ideas from all sorts of people, which I'll be doing actually at my conference on June the 14th, which I'm having on ideas for London. So it's a two-way process, and I can handle these people, Alastair, I can tell you.
I look forward to watching it and reporting upon it, as ever. A pleasure to see you, Christian Wolmar.
Thank you very much
indeed. We're going to have to call it time there. My thanks again to Christian Wolmar, my first half guest. I'll be back in just a couple of moments with Professor Tony Travers of the London School of Economics, and we'll be taking a look at next week's local elections in London. And that promises to be a fascinating discussion as well. I hope very much indeed you will be there when we come back.